A woman was about to be executed for a crime she did not commit. After sitting in the chair, she confessed something that left all the police officers terrified. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the white silk curtains in the spacious bedroom of the Foster mansion, softly illuminating Mrs. Margarita's wrinkled face. The 82-year-old lady rested in her ornate bed, while Elizabeth Walker, her nurse for 3 years, gently adjusted the pillows. The room, decorated with antique furniture and family photographs, was filled with the peaceful sound of the elderly woman's breathing and the subtle aroma of fresh flowers that Elizabeth always made sure to bring. The nurse smiled as she saw her patient slowly open her eyes, whispering tenderly, "Mrs. Margarita, it's time for your medicine. You had a peaceful sleep today, that's very good. You know, I've been observing a significant improvement in your disposition since we started with the new medication. Soon you'll be walking in the garden again, I'm sure." The relationship between Elizabeth and Mrs. Margarita had transformed into something much deeper than a simple professional one. The nurse dedicated herself entirely to caring for the elderly woman, remaining at the mansion throughout the week, returning to her modest home only on weekends. As she organized the medications on the bedside table, Elizabeth fondly recalled the moments when Mrs. Margarita shared stories of her youth in the United States, the traditional parties she attended, the loves she lived. The old lady held the nurse's hand with surprising strength and spoke with a choked voice. "My dear Elizabeth, you are like the daughter I wish Vivian had been. Your dedication, your affection. Sometimes I think God put you in my life to make up for the lack of love my own daughter shows." In the hallway, Vivian Foster's high heels echoed against the marble floor, announcing her arrival like a storm's omen. Mrs. Margarita's daughter was the opposite of her mother in every aspect. Cold, calculating, and obsessed with social status. Dressed in expensive clothes and extravagant jewelry, she entered the room without knocking, interrupting the moment of intimacy between the nurse and her patient. Her look of disdain for Elizabeth was almost palpable as she said, "I imagine the care for my mother is up to date, considering how much she pays for your services. I need to speak with her in private. You can excuse yourself for a few hours." Elizabeth was methodically organizing the evening's medications on the tray when she noticed a subtle change in the room's atmosphere. The air seemed heavier, charged with a tension she couldn't explain. Through the window's reflection, she noticed the tense expressions of mother and daughter, their restrained gestures, the whispered words she couldn't distinguish. Pretending to be focused on her task, she sharpened her ears to catch fragments of the conversation. "Mom, you need to understand that things have changed. You can't keep living like this, as if the money will last forever. The will. You need to consider the family's needs." In the mansion's garden, while picking some herbs for Mrs. Margarita's afternoon tea, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling of unease the conversation between mother and daughter had provoked. The garden, normally her refuge of peace, now seemed gloomy and threatening. Vivian's words about money and the will echoed in her mind, mingling with the stories the other employees whispered about the heiress's greed. Her thoughts were interrupted by a scream from the kitchen. "Elizabeth, come quickly. Mrs. Margarita is having a crisis." Upon returning to the room, Elizabeth found Vivian seated in the red velvet armchair, idly flipping through a fashion magazine while her mother slept. The nurse noticed something different in the air, an almost imperceptible scent of masculine perfume that didn't belong to any of the house's residents. She approached the bedside table and realized the medications had been rearranged, subtly different from how she had left them. With her heart racing, she questioned, "Mrs. Vivian, has anyone else been in the room while I was in the garden? I noticed the medicines have been tampered with, and that can be very dangerous for your mother's health." The silence that followed was thick as fog on a winter morning. Vivian slowly raised her eyes from the magazine, her face a mask of false concern. "Dear Elizabeth, I think you've been working too hard. You're starting to imagine things. No one but me has been here, and I certainly wouldn't mess with my own mother's medication. Perhaps it's time to consider an extended leave, for your own good." That night, as she prepared the last dose of medication for the day, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked each bottle, each pill, searching for any sign of tampering. The room was silent, except for Mrs. Margarita's soft breathing and the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. The nurse held her patient's hand with affection and whispered, "Don't worry, Mrs. Margarita. As long as I'm here, nothing bad will happen to you. I promise I'll protect you, even if it means facing your own daughter." Elizabeth's words floated in the air like a solemn promise as she prepared for another night of vigil. Outside the window, the shadows of trees danced in the garden, casting mysterious shapes on the bedroom walls. The nurse settled into her usual armchair, her notebook in her lap, ready to record any changes in her patient's condition. Her thoughts wandered between concern and determination as she murmured to herself, "Something is very wrong happening in this house, and I need to find out what it is before it's too late. For you, Mrs. Margarita, I'll go all the way." The early morning hours dragged on at the Foster mansion when Elizabeth noticed an unusual commotion in the hallway. The almost imperceptible sound of footsteps trying to be silent caught her attention. Rising from her armchair carefully so as not to wake Mrs. Margarita, the nurse approached the bedroom door, her heart pounding against her chest. Her deep, unfamiliar man's voice whispered something incomprehensible, mixed with Vivian's authoritative tone. "It needs to be done tonight. We can't wait any longer. The will be altered tomorrow." Elizabeth held her breath, trying to capture more details of the conversation, when a creak of the wood under her feet gave her away. The hallway plunged into a sepulchral silence when Vivian abruptly opened the bedroom door, finding Elizabeth standing there. The eyes of Mrs. Margarita's daughter shone with a contained fury, her perfectly painted nails drumming against the wooden door as she said, "What are you doing awake at this hour, Elizabeth? I thought we had agreed that you needed more rest." "You know, I've been thinking that perhaps it would be better to hire a second nurse to split your shifts. It's not healthy for anyone to be so obsessively vigilant." In the dimness of the room, Elizabeth began to notice small alterations in the medication bottles she had organized earlier. Mrs. Margarita's blood pressure pills seemed different, darker, larger. With trembling hands, the nurse examined each bottle, her stomach churning as she confirmed her suspicions. Turning to Vivian, who was still watching her from the doorway, she questioned with a firm voice, "Mrs. Vivian, has anyone other than you been tampering with Mrs. Margarita's medications? Some pills have been switched, and that can be extremely dangerous. As the responsible nurse, I need to know exactly what happened here." The smell of masculine perfume invaded the room again, stronger this time, mixed with the metallic aroma of fear that seemed to emanate from every corner of the bedroom. Mrs. Margarita stirred restlessly in her sleep, murmuring disconnected words. Elizabeth noticed a shadow moving in the hallway, followed by the distinct sound of hurried male footsteps retreating. Vivian maintained her artificial smile as she replied, "Dear, I think you really need to rest. You're seeing conspiracies where there are none. If you continue with these unfounded accusations, I'll have to take more serious measures regarding your employment." The tension in the room was palpable as Elizabeth nervously organized her monitoring equipment. Her years of experience as a nurse screamed that something was terribly wrong. Taking her cell phone, she began to discreetly photograph the altered medication bottles, her hands shaking slightly. Vivian's voice cut through the silence like a razor. "What exactly do you think you're doing? Photographing private property without authorization can have very serious consequences, you know? Maybe it's better if you hand over that cell phone. For your own good." Dawn began to tinge the sky with rosy hues when Elizabeth noticed the first significant change in Mrs. Margarita's vital signs. The elderly woman's breathing was more labored, her skin taking on a worrying grayish tone. Desperate, the nurse began to prepare the emergency equipment, her nimble hands moving with trained precision. From the hallway, the mysterious man's voice sounded again, now closer. "It's done. It shouldn't take long now." The sound was followed by a low, cruel laugh from Vivian. With tears in her eyes, Elizabeth held the increasingly cold hand of Mrs. Margarita, watching helplessly as the elderly woman's vital signs began to falter. Her years of medical training told her that something was very wrong with the patient's reactions. This was not a natural deterioration. Leaning over her patient, she whispered desperately, "Mrs. Margarita, please hold on. I'll get help. I'll prove what they're doing to you. I can't let this happen." The heart monitor began to emit increasingly frequent alert signals, its monotonous beep echoing through the walls of the room like an ominous omen. Elizabeth ran between the medical equipment, trying to stabilize her patient, when Vivian entered the room, her face a mask of false concern. "What's happening to my mother? You should be taking care of her." "If anything happens, it will be your responsibility, Elizabeth. After all, you're the nurse responsible for the medications, aren't you?" As the morning light finally flooded the room, Elizabeth realized she was alone in her struggle. Her eyes burned with unshed tears as she watched Mrs. Margarita's vital signs continue to drop. From the hallway, she could hear Vivian on the phone, her voice laden with false distress. "I need an ambulance immediately. The nurse. She must have done something wrong with the medications. My mother is dying." Despair took hold of Elizabeth as she realized the macabre plan unfolding. "My God, they're not just killing Mrs. Margarita, they're framing me for the crime." The sound of the approaching ambulance siren cut through the morning air like an ominous omen. Elizabeth, her hands shaking and her uniform stained with sweat, stared fixedly at the tampered medication bottles, knowing they were the only proof of her innocence. With a voice choked by fear and anger, she muttered to herself, "I won't let them destroy 2 lives tonight. I'll prove my innocence and bring justice for Mrs. Margarita, even if it's the last thing I do in this life." Donna Margarita's bedroom transformed into a chaotic scene with the environment. Elizabeth remained by the bedside, her hands still clutching the altered medication bottles, as she watched the professionals initiate emergency procedures. The team leader, after quickly checking the rapidly deteriorating vital signs, cast a questioning look at the nurse. "What medications were administered in the last 12 hours? We need to know exactly what happened here." Before Elizabeth could respond, Vivian intervened, her voice laced with venom. "Ask her. She's the one in control of everything. In fact, I've been noticing some strange behaviors in the last few days." The minutes that followed seemed to drag like hours as the medical team fought to stabilize Donna Margarita. Elizabeth desperately tried to explain about the altered medications, the suspicious conversation she had overheard, the mysterious man, but her words seemed to get lost in the chaos of the moment. The sound of emergency equipment filled the room, mingling with Vivian's theatrical sobs, who was now speaking on the phone. "Miguel, come quickly. Something terrible has happened to Mum, and I think we've finally discovered why she's been feeling so unwell lately. That nurse." The heart monitor emitted a shrill, continuous sound that froze the blood of everyone in the room. Elizabeth watched, paralyzed, as the paramedics initiated resuscitation maneuvers. Her hands tightly gripped the medication bottles, her only proof when she felt someone violently rip them from her fingers. Turning quickly, she caught only a glimpse of a male figure disappearing through the door, taking with him her only hope of proving her innocence. The rough, unknown voice still echoed down the hallway. "It's done. Take care of the rest." The medical team leader lowered his head, switching off the equipment with a heavy sigh. Time of death 6:45. At that very moment, as if they had rehearsed, 2 police officers entered the room. Vivian, her face a mask of studied pain, dramatically pointed at Elizabeth. "It was her. She was controlling my mother's medications, altering the doses. I tried to warn about her obsessive behavior, but no one listened to me. Now my mother is." Her voice failed in a perfectly timed sob. As the officers approached, Elizabeth felt the world crumbling around her. Her legs were trembling, but her voice remained steady as she said, "You don't understand. I love Donna Margarita like a mother. Someone switched the medications overnight, I can prove it." But as she searched for the bottles, she realized all evidence had disappeared. In its place, she found only the original medications, perfectly organized, as if they had never been tampered with. The sound of the handcuffs closing around her wrists seemed distant, unreal, as Elizabeth gazed at Donna Margarita's lifeless body. Vivian organized the papers on the side table, discreetly including what appeared to be a will among them. The mysterious man, now wearing a medical uniform Elizabeth didn't recognize, declared to the officers, "As the family's physician, I can attest that there have been suspicious alterations in the patient's condition over the past few weeks, coinciding with the administration of medications by the nurse." Donna Margarita's last words echoed in Elizabeth's mind as she was led out of the room. "You are the daughter I wish Vivian had been." Silent tears streamed down her face as she realized the magnitude of the trap she had fallen into. From the hallway, Vivian could still be seen smiling discreetly as she tucked a paper into her purse, a document that, for a brief moment, Elizabeth recognized as Donna Margarita's old will. In the police car, Elizabeth took one last look at the Foster mansion through the misty window. Her heart was shattered, not only by the loss of her beloved patient, but by the terrible realization that she was being blamed for her death. In her mind, the mysterious man's voice and Vivian's satisfied smile mingled in a macabre dance. With handcuffed hands and a choked voice, she whispered to herself, "Donna Margarita, I swear on my life that I will uncover the truth. Even if it's the last thing I do, I will prove that your own daughter planned your murder." The courtroom was packed that morning when Elizabeth Walker entered, escorted by 2 guards. Her shackles jingled in a melancholic rhythm as she observed the faces staring back at her, with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. 3 months had passed since Donna Margarita's death, and every day in preventive custody had been torture. Her once bright, hopeful eyes now carried deep shadows, silent witnesses to sleepless nights. Her public defender, Esteban Flores, nervously organized a stack of papers on the defense table, whispering in her ear, "Stay calm, Elizabeth. I know the evidence seems bad, but we can still convince the jury of your innocence. We just need you to tell your version exactly as it happened." In the front row of the audience, Vivian Foster sat like a queen on her throne, wearing an elegant black ensemble that seemed more like a party outfit than mourning attire. By her side, the mysterious doctor from that fateful night, now identified as Dr. Miguel Sanchez, maintained a grave, professional expression. Elizabeth felt her stomach churn as she noticed the discreet exchanges of glances between the two, reminding her of the conspiracy she had witnessed that night. Prosecutor Antonio Jacksonez approached the jury, his deep voice filling the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we will present irrefutable evidence of how this nurse, who should have cared for and protected, betrayed her patient's trust in the cruelest way possible." The testimonies began with the paramedics who attended the scene. Every word from them felt like a stab in Elizabeth's heart, especially when they described how they found the medications perfectly organized, an organization she knew wasn't hers. The team leader, nervously adjusting his tie, stated, "When we arrived, all the medications were catalogued and the dosages were clearly altered. The notes in the file, in the defendant's handwriting, showed doses way above the recommended. I've never seen anything so meticulously planned in 15 years of profession." The presentation of physical evidence was a parade of manufactured proof that made Elizabeth feel like she was in a nightmare. Photographs of the medication bottles, toxicology reports, and the most devastating, page after page of forged notes in her handwriting, documenting a false history of improper medication administration. Her lawyer tried to object, but his words seemed to get lost in the air. "Your Honor, I question the integrity of this evidence. My client claims the medications were switched on the night of the incident, and we have reason to believe there was tampering with the evidence." The most painful moment came when Vivian took the witness stand. Her carefully rehearsed tears glistened under the courtroom lights as she narrated a completely twisted story. "I began to notice changes in Elizabeth's behavior weeks before my mother's death. She was obsessive, controlling. She wouldn't let anyone else administer the medications. Now I understand they were signs of what was to come. Her words were pure poison, sweetened with honey, and Elizabeth could see how the jury drank every drop." Miguel Sanchez was the next witness, his authoritative presence dominating the courtroom. With surgical precision, he deconstructed every argument from the defense, presenting a detailed analysis of the medical records that, coincidentally, were only discovered after Donna Margarita's death. His voice, which Elizabeth would recognize anywhere, now sounded professional and distant. As Donna Margarita's personal physician, I can attest that her health began to deteriorate suspiciously in the final weeks of her life. The signs of progressive poisoning are evident in the tests I conducted. The hours dragged on as Elizabeth watched her life being methodically destroyed by well-constructed lies. Each new piece of evidence presented seemed more convincing than the last, each witness more certain in her condemnation. Her lawyer did his best, but was clearly outmatched by the well-oiled prosecution machine. His voice trembling, he tried to argue, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I ask that you consider my client's impeccable history, her years of dedication to the profession, What kind of person would dedicate 3 years of their life to such an elaborate plan? Prosecutor Antonio Jacksones prowled around the room like a predator circling its prey, his voice dripping with moral indignation. A nurse who abuses the trust of an elderly, defenseless patient deserves no mercy. The evidence is clear. We have the altered records, the toxicology reports, the witnesses. Every piece fits together perfectly to show a meticulous murder plot. Elizabeth felt the weight of each word like a chain closing around her as she whispered to herself, "Donna Margarita, forgive me for not being able to protect you, but I swear I will find a way to prove the truth." Judge Javier Wallace observed it all with an inscrutable expression, occasionally making notes in his pad. Little did Elizabeth know, her fate had been sealed long before she entered that courtroom. As the afternoon sun cast elongated shadows across the high courthouse windows, she thought bitterly. They planned it all so perfectly. Every detail, every piece of evidence, every witness. How can I fight against such a well-orchestrated conspiracy? Elizabeth's heart raced as she took the witness stand. The moment she had so dreaded had arrived, her one chance to try and convince the jury of her innocence. Cold sweat trickled down her back as she looked into the impassive faces before her. Her lawyer, Esteban Flores, nervously adjusted his tie before beginning his questioning. "Miss Walker, please tell the jury exactly what happened that night." Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth began her account. "I realized something was wrong when I heard voices in the hallway. It was late at night, and I recognized Mrs. Vivian's voice talking to a man. They were speaking about the will, about how everything had to be done that night." Prosecutor Antonio Jacksones shot up abruptly, his voice cutting through the air like a razor. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is attempting to create a conspiracy theory without any concrete evidence." Judge Javier Wallace, who until then had been absent-mindedly flipping through some documents, looked up with disinterest. "Objection sustained. Miss Walker, restrict yourself to the facts you can prove." Elizabeth felt despair rising in her chest as she watched her only chance at a defense being systematically obliterated. The tension in the courtroom escalated when Esteban tried to submit the security camera footage from the mansion. It was his sole concrete evidence, showing a male figure entering the house late at night. Before he could play the footage, Vivian stood up, her voice laced with false concern. "Your Honor, I must warn that those cameras were installed without legal authorization on private property." Judge Wallace didn't even hesitate. Evidence rejected for being illegally obtained. Elizabeth watched helplessly as her last hope of proving the mysterious man's presence vanished. The most devastating moment came when the prosecutor began his cross-examination. Each question was a carefully laid trap, each of Elizabeth's responses twisted and contorted. "So, Miss Walker, you claim someone entered the room and switched the medications, but you didn't see who it was. You claim you overheard a suspicious conversation, but have no proof. You admit you were the only person responsible for the medications, but deny altering the dosages. How do you expect the jury to believe your word against all the concrete evidence we have presented?" Desperate, Elizabeth tried once more to explain about the missing medication bottles, about the changes she noticed, about Vivian's suspicious behavior. Her words sounded emptier and emptier in the face of the prosecutor's constant objections and the judge's dismissive nods. With tears in her eyes, she pleaded, "Please, you have to listen to me. Why would I kill someone I loved like a mother? Why would I risk my career, my life, everything I've fought for? Donna Margarita trusted me. She knew her daughter." The prosecutor interrupted her with a cruel smile. "Perhaps precisely because of that, Miss Walker. The records show that Donna Margarita was planning to change her will. Curiously, you would have been the beneficiary of a considerable amount. A humble nurse, suddenly having the chance to inherit a fortune. Quite tempting, don't you think?" Elizabeth felt her blood run cold. It was the first time she had heard about this alleged change in the will, one more piece carefully planted to incriminate her. Judge Wallace consulted his watch impatiently as Esteban made one last desperate attempt to save his client. He presented records of Elizabeth's impeccable professional history, letters of recommendation, testimonies from former patients. The judge barely glanced at the documents before declaring, "Irrelevant to the case at hand, an exemplary history does not exclude the possibility of a premeditated crime." Elizabeth watched in disbelief as each piece of evidence in her favor was summarily discarded. The afternoon wore on, and with it grew the sense that all was lost. From her place, Elizabeth could see Vivian whispering something in Dr. Miguel's ear, both barely able to hide their satisfied smiles. The prosecutor was preparing for his closing remarks, organizing his notes with an air of triumph. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we see here today is the portrait of a heinous betrayal. A professional who used her knowledge not to heal but to kill." At the defense table, Esteban whispered words of consolation that rang hollow. "We still have the appeals process, Elizabeth. I won't give up fighting for you." But both knew it was a lost battle. Judge Wallace had already made his position clear, systematically ignoring any evidence that might benefit the defense. Elizabeth thought bitterly, they even bought the judge. How many more people are involved in this conspiracy? The sun was beginning to set, casting orange shadows through the courtroom windows, when the prosecutor made his final statement. "Society expects healthcare professionals to be guardians of life, not messengers of death. Today we have the opportunity to serve justice, to show that no one is above the law." Elizabeth closed her eyes, her last hopes crumbling like a sandcastle. "God, please don't let them win. Don't let the lie triumph over the truth." The silence in the courtroom was deafening as the jury returned from their deliberation. Elizabeth felt each beat of her heart like a drum announcing her sentence. The hours of waiting had been a torture, each minute dragging like an eternity. She watched the 12 solemn faces that would decide her fate, searching in vain for any sign of compassion or doubt. The jury foreman, a gray-haired gentleman, rose with a trembling paper in his hands. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, this jury finds the defendant, Elizabeth Walker, guilty of premeditated murder in the first degree. The world seemed to slow down as Judge Javier Wallace picked up his gavel, preparing to deliver the sentence. Vivian Foster was discreetly adjusting her pearl necklace, an almost imperceptible smile dancing on her lips, while Dr. Miguel maintained his rehearsed professional expression. The judge cleared his throat, his voice echoing through the room like a divine decree. "Elizabeth Walker, given the gravity of the crime committed, the position of trust you betrayed, and the premeditated nature of your actions, this court sees no alternative but to sentence you to the maximum penalty allowed by law. You are hereby sentenced to death by electric chair." The scream that escaped Elizabeth's lips seemed to come from the depths of her soul. She rose abruptly, her shackles clanging in metallic protest. "No, you can't do this. I'm innocent." She planned it all. Her and that doctor killed Mrs. Margarita. The guards quickly advanced, grabbing her arms as she continued to shout, "Vivian, tell the truth. Tell them about the man in the hallway, about the will." "Please, you can't let an innocent person die." Esteban Flores was desperately trying to reach his client amid the chaos that had engulfed the courtroom. His words were lost in the commotion. "Your Honor, I immediately request an appeal. There is evidence that was not considered, witnesses who were not heard." Judge Wallace completely ignored his protests, his voice cutting through the air like a guillotine. "Order in the court. Take the condemned away. This session is adjourned." As she was dragged toward the door, Elizabeth saw Vivian approach Dr. Miguel, her words only a whisper that still reached her ears. "It's done. Now everything that was hers is ours." The doctor nodded discreetly, tucking what appeared to be a copy of the will into his briefcase. In that moment, the terrible reality of the conspiracy hit Elizabeth with full force. It wasn't just about killing Mrs. Margarita, it was about utterly destroying anyone who might threaten their plans. The courthouse hallway seemed endless as Elizabeth was led away by the guards. Her legs could barely support her, but her voice did not cease. "Please, someone needs to hear me. They planned everything. The doctor was there that night. He switched the medications. Vivian organized it all to get the inheritance." Her words echoed off the marble walls, falling on deaf ears of people who had already decided her fate. Photographers jostled to capture the moment, their flashes exploding like tiny lightning bolts in the hallway. Elizabeth could see the headlines of the next day forming, "Killer nurse sentenced to death." Her life, her reputation, everything was being destroyed before her eyes, while the true killers walked free, protected by their money and influence. At the courthouse exit, Elizabeth made one final desperate attempt to be heard, Turning to the cameras surrounding her, she shouted with all the strength she had left, "I devoted my life to saving people. How can you believe I would be capable of killing someone I loved like a mother? Vivian Foster and Dr. Miguel Sanchez are the real murderers. They set this whole thing up." The sun was setting on the horizon when the prison van began to move, taking Elizabeth to death row. Through the small barred window, she saw Vivian and Dr. Miguel leaving the courthouse, getting into their luxurious cars as if they were leaving just another normal workday. In her heart, a burning promise was forming. This won't stay like this. Even if it's the last thing I do, I'll find a way to prove the truth. Mrs. Margarita, I promise your death won't be in vain. On the sidewalk, a solitary figure watched the van drive away. The fired police officer Jackson Wallace, who had discreetly followed the entire trial, frowned as he jotted something down in his worn notebook. Something is very wrong with this case, and I'm going to find out what it is. Jackson Wallace's apartment was a perfect reflection of the chaos that ruled his life. Empty bottles piled up in the corners, old newspapers covered every available surface, and the smell of cigarette smoke permeated the stagnant air. Sitting in his worn armchair, the fired cop watched the headlines about the Walker case for the 1,000th time. The faint morning light filtered through the dusty curtains, illuminating his face marked by deep dark circles and an unshaven beard of several days. His eyes, though tired, maintained that peculiar glint his former colleagues so feared, the look of someone who couldn't leave an unsolved case. There's something wrong here, something everyone is letting slip by. The clock struck 3 in the afternoon when Jackson finally got up, staggering to the messy kitchen. His hands shook as he tried to brew a strong coffee, a pathetic attempt to replace the bottle of whiskey calling him from the cupboard. The medical reports scattered across the table told a story he tried to ignore. Early-stage cirrhosis, severe depression, recommendation for immediate leave from work. Picking up the steaming cup, he muttered to himself, 25 years on the force, and where did it get me? A drunk, broken cop obsessed with a case that shouldn't even be mine. The walls of the apartment told the story of a once brilliant career now in ruins. Dust-covered medals of honor, yellowed photographs of better times, newspaper clippings celebrating his past achievements. Jackson stopped in front of them, his reflection on the blurred glass showing a man he barely recognized. His hand instinctively reached for the badge that was no longer there as his mind wandered. They took everything from me because I couldn't follow the rules, because I didn't know when to stop. But this time there's something different. The case of the convicted nurse had captured his attention from the very first moment. There was something about the story that didn't fit, details that seemed too perfectly aligned. Jackson began to spread the newspaper clippings on the floor, creating an improvised timeline. His hands were still shaking, but his eyes were focused like they hadn't been in months. An exemplary nurse, no criminal record, devoted to the patient for 3 years, and suddenly decides to kill her? It doesn't make sense. It's too clean, too organized. The sun was already setting when Jackson found the first strange detail. In a small, almost imperceptible footnote, there was a mention of the family doctor, Dr. Miguel Sanchez, taking over the case only 2 weeks before Mrs. Margarita's death. Picking up his worn notebook, he began to make frantic notes. Why change the trusted doctor so close to the end? And why did no one question this during the trial? The hours dragged on as Jackson delved deeper and deeper into the case. Each new discovery seemed to lead to more unanswered questions. His old police instincts, dulled by alcohol and depression, began to awaken. Getting up with difficulty, he started creating an improvised mural on one of the walls, connecting reports with pieces of string. There's a pattern here, something they don't want anyone to see. But what? The clock was nearing midnight when the first bottle of whiskey was opened. Jackson knew he was breaking his sobriety promise, but the tremor in his hands was becoming unbearable. As the amber liquid burned his throat, his eyes never left the mural he had created. What kind of murderer leaves so much evidence? It's like someone carefully planted each clue. But who would have so much to gain from the death of a wealthy elderly woman? A loud knock on the door startled him. His neighbor, annoyed by the noise of his nightly investigation, was shouting threats from the hallway. Jackson barely heard him, his eyes fixed on a photograph from the courthouse, Vivian Foster, the victim's daughter, talking with Dr. Sanchez at the back of the room. There was something about their body language, an intimacy that seemed out of place. They knew each other, but from where? And for how long? The distant sound of sirens brought him back to reality. Jackson watched his reflection in the dark window, a ruined man, battling his own demons while trying to solve a mystery no one else seemed interested in investigating. Picking up his phone, he began to dial a number he hadn't used in months. "Florence, I need your help. I know I have no right to ask anything after everything, but there's an innocent woman about to die, and I think I've found something no one else saw." The whiskey bottle was almost empty when Jackson felt the first wave of nausea. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold the phone, while Florence's voice on the other end of the line grew more distant. His former partner, now a homicide investigator, tried to make sense of his disjointed words. "Jackson, you need to calm down. You're drinking again, aren't you? I can't help if you're not sober." Staggering to the bathroom, he stared at his reflection in the stained mirror. "Florence, you don't understand. There's something big going on here. That nurse, Elizabeth, she was used. Someone planned all of this." The sound of the phone hitting the wall echoed through the empty apartment. Jackson slid to the floor, his head spinning as familiar demons haunted him. Images of old cases, faces of victims he couldn't save, moments of weakness that cost his career. It all blended together in a macabre dance in his mind. Through the alcoholic haze, a voice in his head screamed louder and louder. "Get up! An innocent woman will die if you don't do something. It's your last chance to do the right thing." The digital clock blinked 3:40 in the morning when Jackson finally managed to drag himself back to his makeshift mural. His red eyes scanned the connections he had traced, desperately searching for the pattern he knew was there. One photograph in particular caught his attention: Dr. Miguel Sanchez leaving the courthouse after the verdict. There was something about his face, an almost imperceptible smile that seemed out of place for someone who had just witnessed in a murder case. "You're hiding something, aren't you?" But what? The following hours were a constant battle between his need to investigate and the increasingly violent shakes of withdrawal. Jackson tried to focus on the reports, but the letters danced before his eyes as his body begged for more alcohol. Cold sweat ran down his face as he mumbled to himself, "I can't drink now, I need to think clearly. There's a connection here, something I'm almost seeing." The dawn found Jackson surrounded by dozens of fresh newspaper clippings, his hands stained with ink as he scribbled frantically in his notebook. Each new article revealed small inconsistencies, details that seemed insignificant in isolation, but were beginning to form a disturbing pattern. His hoarse voice echoed through the empty apartment. The will. It all starts and ends with the will. But why did nobody question the changes? Why did nobody investigate the doctor's history? A sudden wave of nausea made him drop a stack of documents. As he tried to reorganize them with shaking hands, his eyes caught something he had missed before. A small note in a newspaper from 3 months ago, mentioning the sale of a private clinic. The name of the buyer made his heart race. Miguel Sanchez, buying a luxury clinic 2 weeks after Doña Margarita's death. Where did all that money come from? The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him freeze. Years of police experience had sharpened his instincts, and something about that movement didn't seem normal. Dragging himself to the window, Jackson saw a black car parked across the street, 2 men in suits watching his building. His heart pounded. They know I'm investigating, but how? Who talked? The phone rang, making Jackson jump. It was Florence again, her voice now heavy with genuine concern. "Jackson, listen carefully. Stop investigating this case now. I just received an official warning. If you keep snooping, they'll reopen your dismissal process. This time, they won't just take your badge." He cut her off, his voice shaking from more than just withdrawal. "Florence, that's exactly why I have to keep going. They're trying to silence me, which means I'm getting close to something big." The walls of the apartment seemed to close in on him as the reality of his situation became clear. On one side, his personal demons threatened to consume him. On the other, a conspiracy far bigger than he'd imagined was beginning to unfold. Clutching the last bottle of whiskey in his shaking hands, Jackson faced the toughest choice of his life. I can give in now, go back to the bottle and forget all of this, or I can be the cop I once was. The choice I make in the next few hours will determine whether an innocent woman lives or dies. The whiskey bottle shattered against the wall. its contents oozing slowly like golden tears. Jackson had made his choice. With hands still shaking but mind growing clearer, he turned his full attention back to the evidence wall. The morning sun now fully illuminated the apartment, revealing connections the darkness had hidden. His eyes raced feverishly over every clipping, every photograph, every scribbled note. It has to be here. There has to be something that proves the link between them. Amidst piles of old reports, Jackson found a society photograph from 6 months ago. It was a charity event at a local hospital. His eyes widened as he noticed, in the background of the image, Vivian Foster and Miguel Sanchez, conversing intimately in a corner. The date of the photo was crucial. 3 months before Doña Margarita's death, long before the doctor was supposedly assigned to the case. They lied. They already knew each other. But why hide it? What else are they hiding? With renewed energy, Jackson began piecing together a new timeline. His hands flew over the documents, ordering events, connecting dates. The pattern began to emerge like a sinister web. The clinic purchase, the will changes, the convenient doctor swap, all perfectly timed. Speaking to himself, his voice trembled with excitement. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a corporate execution. Every move was calculated, every detail planned months in advance. The most shocking revelation came when Jackson started digging into Dr. Miguel Sanchez's background. In his frantic search, he found a small obituary note from 2 years ago. Another elderly patient, another suspicious death, another will changed in the final weeks of life. His blood ran cold. It wasn't the first time. They'd done this before. But that time there was no nurse to frame. Police sirens blaring down the street made Jackson instinctively duck. Through the window he could see the black car was still there, its mysterious occupants keeping constant watch. With trembling fingers, he grabbed his phone and began photographing every shred of evidence, every connection he'd uncovered. His voice was barely a whisper. If anything happens to me, someone needs to know the truth. The sound of footsteps in the hallway returned, this time closer. Jackson could hear muffled voices, the distinct jingle of a key being inserted into the next apartment's lock. Quickly he began stashing the most damning evidence into an old folder. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. They're getting closer, but they can't stop me now, not when I'm this close. That's when his eyes caught something he'd missed before. In the courtroom photo, partially hidden behind Vivian, was a document slipping from her file. Using a magnifying glass, Jackson could just make out part of the header. Partnership agreement, clinic. The rest was blurred, but it was enough. His hands shook as he made the final connection. The clinic. It wasn't just a bribe. It was payment for a hit. The sound of shattering glass in the hallway made him jump. Jackson grabbed the evidence folder, his brain working feverishly to find an escape route. The voices were even closer now, no longer trying to hide. With trembling hands, he typed one last message to Florence. I found the link. The clinic is the key to everything. If anything happens to me, look into Isabel Foster's obituary 2 years ago. Same doctor, same M.O. The doorknob of his door began to turn slowly. Jackson took one last look at his mural, at the connections he had made, at the truth he had uncovered. A bitter smile formed on his lips as he whispered, Elizabeth Walker, you're not alone in this fight, and now I have a way to prove your innocence. The apartment door opened violently. The morning light invaded Jackson's apartment through the foggy windows, illuminating the transformation the place had undergone overnight. What was once just a chaotic living room had now become an improvised investigation center. The main wall, once covered with damp stains, now displayed an elaborate map of connections. Photographs, newspaper clippings, and notes occupied every available inch, all connected by red wires that snaked like exposed veins. Jackson, now on his 3rd day of sobriety, adjusted a new photograph to the mural while muttering to himself, every murder has a pattern, a signature, and this one has all the marks of a professional operation. Florence arrived at the apartment carrying 2 paper bags, one with strong coffee, and the other with the files she had managed to borrow from the department. Her face showed a mixture of concern and admiration at the dedication of her former partner. Jackson's deep dark circles and still trembling hands betrayed his struggle against addiction. but his eyes shone with a clarity she hadn't seen in years. Depositing the files on the makeshift table, she commented, "Jackson, you're stirring up a hornet's nest. Half of these documents are confidential, and the other half, well, let's just say some powerful people won't be happy to know we're investigating." The center of the mural showed an enlarged photograph of Mrs. Margarita Foster, surrounded by images of everyone involved in the case. Jackson had traced lines connecting each person, each event, every seemingly insignificant detail. Next to the photo of Dr. Miguel Sanchez, a series of documents detailed the recent acquisition of his private clinic. Close to this, reports on Vivian Foster revealed a pattern of suspicious business dealings and questionable political connections. From his worn chair, Jackson observed the mural intently as he shared his findings. "Look at this, Florence. In the last 5 years, 4 wealthy elderly people died under similar circumstances. In each case, there were suspicious alterations to wills, sudden changes of doctors, and always someone convenient to blame." The hours dragged on as they delved deeper and deeper into the investigation. Florence methodically organized each new document, creating a detailed timeline of events. Her investigator training helped her see patterns others might have missed. With a cup of cold coffee in hand, she pointed to a series of disturbing coincidences. "Jackson, did you notice? In each case, there was a healthcare professional who was blamed. A nurse, a nursing assistant, even a physical therapist. They all had spotless records until they were accused, and they were all tried by the same judge." A sound from the hallway made Jackson approach the door cautiously. Through the peephole, he saw only the mailman walking away. Upon opening the door, he found a brown envelope with no return address. Inside, a single photograph, his apartment photographed from the street, with the living room window clearly showing his investigation mural. On the back, a simple message: "Some cases must remain closed." Showing the photo to Florence, his voice trembled, not with fear but with certainty. "We're close to something big. They wouldn't bother threatening us if we weren't on the right track." The afternoon wore on when Florence discovered something in the files about Judge Javier Wallace. In recent years, his rulings in cases involving certain companies followed a suspicious pattern. Even more intriguing were the frequent trips he took to the same luxury resort where Vivian Foster used to spend her weekends. Sharing her findings with Jackson, she whispered, "This goes way beyond a simple murder. We're talking about an entire network of corruption and power." Jackson paid special attention to the records from the night of the murder. Something about the official report bothered him. The technical precision with which the medications were tampered suggested knowledge not just of medicine, but of police procedures as well. Someone who knew exactly how a poisoning investigation would be conducted. As he studied the details, he shared his theory with Florence. The killer is no amateur. They knew exactly how to plant the evidence, how to manipulate the crime scene. That kind of knowledge requires inside access to the department. The shadows of night began to stretch when Florence found a disturbing connection. In her search for patterns, she had discovered that the same police officer appeared peripherally in several of the previous cases, always as a secondary witness, never as the lead investigator. Before she could delve deeper into her discovery, a sound of breaking glass in the hallway made them freeze. Jackson quickly turned off the lights, whispering, "Someone's watching us, and this time, they don't just want to scare us." The silence that followed was deafening. Jackson and Florence remained motionless in the dark, their hearts pounding so loudly they seemed to echo off the walls. Years of police experience told them they were in real danger. With calculated movements, Jackson began gathering the most important evidence into a folder, whispering to his partner, "We need to get everything out of here. They're not going to give us much more time." A new envelope slid under the door, this time containing only a newspaper clipping. The news of Elizabeth Walker's death sentence by electric chair. The words 2 weeks were scrawled in red over the headline. Jackson felt his stomach turn. "Time's running out, Florence. We've got 2 weeks to stop an innocent woman from being executed for a crime she didn't commit." The night had completely set in when the first shot pierced through the window of Jackson's apartment. The glass exploded into thousands of fragments, while he and Florence threw themselves to the ground. The bullet hit the center of the mural precisely, piercing through Donna Margarita's photograph. Crawling to a more protected corner, Jackson pulled his old gun from the drawer while whispering to Florence, This is no longer a warning. They are trying to silence us. We need to get all the evidence out of here now." Jackson's phone rang, cutting through the tense silence that had settled. The voice on the other end was deep and controlled. "Investigator Wallace, your reputation has always been that of someone who knows how to recognize a lost cause. I suggest you reactivate that instinct. There are certain cases that must remain resolved. Consider the shot as a friendly reminder that not everyone has as much patience as I do." Jackson felt his blood boil as he replied, "Who is speaking? How did you get this number?" Florence was working quickly, putting crucial documents in a folder while scanning others with her phone. Her hands trembled slightly, but years of police training kept her focused. A noise in the hallway made her stop, heavy footsteps approaching. Her voice was just a whisper. "Jackson, someone else is coming. We need an escape route. They can't get this evidence, not after what we discovered about the judge and that corrupt cop." The second shot came from the hallway, piercing through the apartment door. Jackson pushed Florence behind a cabinet as he yelled, "Get down!" The bullet went straight through where she was standing seconds before. Amid the chaos, Jackson noticed something familiar about the gunshot sound. It was a standard police firearm. His mind working as he whispered, "Florence, these aren't common hired killers. They're cops. Someone from the department is neck-deep in this." A new envelope slid under the door, this time containing photos of Florence's daughter leaving school. The message was clear. They knew everything about their lives, and no one was safe. Florence felt her heart stop for a moment, her hands gripping the envelope so tightly her fingers turned white. "Jackson, they're watching our families. How can we fight people with no limits?" The sound of approaching sirens spurred Jackson into action. Years of experience told him this wasn't a rescue. It was a trap. Grabbing the folder with the most important evidence, he began guiding Florence towards the fire escape. "We need to split up. You take the original documents, I'll keep the digital copies. If they catch one of us, the other still has a chance to prove the truth." More gunshots echoed down the hallway, this time accompanied by authoritative voices ordering them to open the door. Jackson recognized one of the voices. It belonged to someone high-ranking in the police department. His heart raced even faster as he realized the extent of the conspiracy. "Florence, this goes way beyond a murder. It's an organized operation, with powerful people protecting something much bigger." Jackson's phone vibrated with a text message. It was a photo of his mother's apartment, followed by a simple text, "Last chance. Stop now or we start with the ones you love." His hands shook with rage as he showed the message to Florence. "They know we're close. They know we discovered the connection between Judge Wallace, Vivian, and that mysterious cop who always shows up in the cases." A loud bang on the door announced that time was up. They were breaking in. Jackson pushed Florence towards the fire escape, handing her a flash drive. "Here's everything we found. Go to that place we used to meet for old cases. Don't trust anyone at the department." Florence hesitated for a moment before disappearing into the darkness, her last words almost lost in the chaos. "Jackson, don't do anything stupid. Elizabeth Walker needs us alive." The door finally gave way, and armed men stormed the apartment. Jackson stood motionless in the center of the room, his hands raised as he watched familiar faces among the intruders. Cops he'd known for years, now acting like mercenaries. A familiar voice cut through the silence. "Jackson Wallace, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice and interference with a closed case. Don't make this worse for yourself. Forget everything you found out about Walker." Jackson was sitting in a cold interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the metal table. Through the reflection in the two-way mirror, he could see the deplorable state he was in. Bruised face, torn shirt, a trickle of blood running down his temple. The last 12 hours had been a nightmare of aggressive interrogations and veiled threats, but in his mind, only one thing mattered. Florence had escaped with the most important evidence, and he needed to buy her time. Staring at his reflection, he muttered, "Bring it on. I'm not giving you what you want." The police chief, Antonio Hernandez, entered the room carrying a thick folder, Jackson's professional history. His normally friendly face now bore a studied mask of disappointment as he sat down. "Jackson, I'm going to be direct. Your obsession with the Walker case is hurting a lot of people. Judge Wallace called personally, concerned about your parallel investigations. You're digging your own grave, and for what? For a convicted killer. In the last hours of investigation before the raid, Jackson had found something disturbing. Records of suspicious bank transfers between shell companies linked to Vivian Foster and accounts that could be connected to Judge Wallace. It was all circumstantial, nothing he could prove in court, but the patterns were too clear to be a coincidence. Keeping his expression neutral, he replied, "I'm just doing my job, or at least the job no one else had the guts to do." A new officer walked into the room, whispering something into Antonio's ear. Jackson noticed a subtle shift in his expression. Something had gone wrong with their plans. The police chief tried to maintain his composure as he slid a photograph across the table. It was Jackson's investigation board, completely destroyed. His voice carried a thinly veiled threat. "We didn't find anything at your apartment. No evidence, no documents. Where is it all, Jackson? Where is Florence?" The mention of his former partner's name made Jackson's blood boil, but he kept his expression impassive. In his mind, he replayed the connections he had uncovered. The pattern of deaths of wealthy elderly victims, always with the same modus operandi, always with the same judge presiding over the cases, always with some innocent professional to take the fall. And now, for the first time, a real threat to their operation, a nurse who had witnessed something she shouldn't have. Allowing a slight smile to form on his bruised lips, he answered, "I have no idea what you're talking about." The following hours were a game of cat and mouse. More officers came in and out of the room, each trying a different approach. Threats, promises, appeals to his conscience. Nothing worked. Jackson knew that every minute he kept them busy was one more minute for Florence to organize the evidence and find help. His mind kept going back to one detail he had noticed in the records: frequent calls between Judge Wallace's personal cell phone and a number registered to one of Vivian's companies, always on the days leading up to the suspicious deaths. The sun was already setting when Antonio returned for the last time, now with a different expression. He placed a new photograph on the table. Jackson recognized Florence's car parked outside a roadside hotel. "We haven't found her yet, but it's only a matter of time. You have a choice to make, Jackson. You can tell us where the evidence is now, or you can watch your partner get dragged into the same hole you dug." A young officer rushed into the room, handing Antonio a paper. Jackson watched his reaction closely. Something had deeply disturbed him. Taking advantage of the moment of distraction, he allowed a thought to slip out loud. "It's interesting how some patterns repeat, isn't it? Same characters, same stories. Except this time you chose the wrong victim to frame." The chief abruptly stood up, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. Before leaving, he turned to Jackson with an icy look. "You have 48 hours to hand over everything you have." After that, he left the threat hanging in the air, but Jackson barely heard him. His mind was focused on a crucial detail he had noticed in those final seconds. On the paper the young officer had brought, there was an official Department of Executions header. The date set for Elizabeth's execution had been moved up. Alone in the interrogation room, Jackson allowed a bitter smile to form on his bruised face. They were afraid, and that meant he and Florence were on the right track. He whispered to himself, "Time is running out, Elizabeth. But I promise I won't let you die for a crime you didn't commit, even if it's the last thing I do." The cold corridors of the Savannah Women's Penitentiary echoed with the metallic sound of bars being locked for the night count. Elizabeth Walker, now known only by the number 1742, huddled on her thin mattress, trying to ignore the pains that coursed through her body. 3 months had passed since her conviction, and each day was a new lesson in survival. Her once clean and tidy orange uniform, like everything in her life, now showed stains that no amount of washing could remove, physical marks of her new reality. Her thoughts wandered as she watched the shadows on the wall. "Mrs. Margarita, you wouldn't believe what your death has caused. Your daughter succeeded. She destroyed not only your life, but mine as well." Breakfast was always the first daily test of endurance. Elizabeth clutched her metal tray with shaky hands, trying to blend into the crowd of inmates. A sharp voice cut through the cafeteria. "Look who's here, the killer nurse. Watch out for the grits, they might be poisoned." Laughter echoed through the room as she sat in an isolated corner, swallowing not only the bland food, but also her dignity. An older inmate passing by her table whispered with disdain, "My mother died in a nursing home. People like you deserve far worse than the electric chair." During yard time, Elizabeth tried to stay close to the guards, a strategy that didn't always work. The yard was a minefield of rivalries and hierarchies, and she was at the bottom of the prison's social pyramid. Her medical knowledge, once a source of pride, was now her greatest curse. Other inmates avoided her, as if her alleged ability to kill was contagious. A younger prisoner, new to the block, tried to approach her for conversation, but was quickly pulled away by others. "Stay away from her. That one kills old folks with a smile on her face. Imagine what she could do to a newbie like you." The nights were the worst. Alone in her cell, Elizabeth could no longer maintain the facade of strength she presented during the day. Her delicate fingers, which once saved lives, now traced invisible patterns on the rough walls. The silence was broken only by the muffled sobs of other prisoners and occasional distant screams. At times like these, she allowed her own tears to fall, whispering to herself, "Mom, I miss you so much. You always said the truth prevails, but in here, the truth has no value at all." The prison routine was a macabre dance of survival. Every move had to be calculated, every word measured. The other inmates had turned nurse into an insult, a mark of Cain that followed her through the halls. During a mandatory session with the prison psychologist, Elizabeth tried to explain her torment. "It's not just the confinement, doctor. It's as if every person in here has made it their mission to remind me that, in the eyes of the world, I'm a monster. And the worst part is, I can't even blame them. If I were on the other side, I might think the same." The prison infirmary, which should have been her natural refuge, became yet another place of torture. The doctors and nurses treated her with a particular disdain, as if her mere presence was a stain on the profession. When she developed an infection after being assaulted in the yard, the attending physician barely glanced at her wounds. How ironic, isn't it? The elderly killer in need of medical care. Take a painkiller and go back to your cell. I have real patients to attend to. The visits were rare. Few friends had remained by her side after the conviction. Her public defender appeared occasionally, always with the same defeated expression, always with the same discouraging news about denied appeals. Sitting in the empty visitors area, Elizabeth watched other inmates hugging their families, thinking bitterly, "Even the worst criminals here receive visits. I, who am innocent, am completely alone." The nightmares were constant. Every night, Elizabeth relived Mrs. Margarita's final moments, the arrival of the paramedics, the accusations, the trial. She always woke up at the same moment, when the sentence was pronounced. Her cellmate, a quiet woman serving time for theft, sometimes heard her murmuring during these episodes, "It wasn't me. Please believe me. I didn't kill her." The hours dragged like days, the days like months. Elizabeth felt her spirit slowly breaking, like a branch exposed to constant pressure. Her hands, once steady when administering medication, now trembled constantly. Sitting in her cell, looking through the bars at the night sky, she allowed a dark thought to escape. Maybe it's easier to accept what they say. Maybe it's simpler to become the monster they all believe I am. The day began like so many others in prison, with screams. Elizabeth had barely gotten up when a group of inmates gathered in front of her cell. The leader, a tall woman known as Viper, pressed her face against the bars, her hot breath reaching Elizabeth. "Hey, Devil's Nurse. I heard my aunt is admitted to the same hospital where you worked. If anything happens to her, you'll wish that electric chair had already fried your brain." The group laughed as they walked away, leaving Elizabeth trembling in her corner, the words "electric chair" echoing in her mind like a death sentence. During that morning's outdoor time, Elizabeth immediately realized something was wrong. The yard was too quiet, the guards strategically distracted. When she tried to return inside the prison, she felt strong hands grabbing her arms. 5 inmates dragged her behind the bleachers, out of sight of the cameras. The first blow hit her stomach, knocking all the air out of her lungs. Amid the assaults, she heard the accusations. "My grandma died in a nursing home last year. And if it was you, how many other old folks did you kill before getting caught, you murderer?" The infirmary was crowded when Elizabeth was practically dragged there by a guard. Her face was swollen, a trickle of blood running from her mouth. The on-duty doctor barely looked at her before making his disdainful diagnosis. "Nothing serious. Some bruises and mild contusions. You can go back to your cell." When Elizabeth tried to explain about the sharp pain in her ribs, he cut her off sharply. Do you know how many helpless elderly people feel pain before dying poisoned? Go back to your cell, now. The cafeteria became an arena of daily humiliations. That afternoon, as Elizabeth tried to eat her cold meal, a group of inmates deliberately passed by her table, knocking a tray of hot soup over her. The scalding food soaked through her uniform, burning her skin, but what hurt most were the laughter and comments. Oops, sorry, but at least it wasn't poison, right? Or do you prefer your murders more subtle, nurse? The mandatory group therapy sessions were another form of torture. The psychologist insisted Elizabeth participate, even knowing how the other inmates treated her. That session, as soon as it was her turn to speak, an inmate interrupted her. Why do we have to listen to this murderer? She killed an old lady who trusted her. How can we trust anything she says? The psychologist merely watched in silence as the entire group turned against Elizabeth. The most painful moment came during cell inspections. The guards, citing an anonymous tip, rifled through all her few possessions. They found her meager personal belongings, including the only photo she had of her mother. One guard held up the photograph with disdain. Looking for poison recipes in old notes, or maybe planning your next murder? When they returned the photo, it was purposefully torn in half. At night, alone in her cell, Elizabeth tried to clean the wounds she could reach. Her whole body ached, but it was her soul that was truly hurt. The torn photo of her mother rested in her lap, as silent tears streamed down her face. Mum, you always said God doesn't give a burden greater than we can bear, but I don't know if I can take it anymore. I don't know if I have the strength to keep going. Sleep, when it came, was plagued by nightmares. That night she relived finding the tampered medications, the mysterious voice in the hallway, Vivian's satisfied smile. She woke up screaming, only to find her cell pitch black and her throat hoarse. The night guard came by, banging her baton on the bars. Shut up, murderer, let the others sleep, or I'll give you a real reason to scream. The following morning brought another round of violence, this time on the way to the showers. A group of inmates cornered her, throwing boiling water on her legs. As Elizabeth screamed in pain, they laughed and mocked. That's for you to learn what real pain feels like. How many old folks did you make suffer before killing them, you monster? The guards only showed up after it was all over, pretending not to see her obvious burns. In her cell, Elizabeth examined her new injuries, adding to the old ones. Her body was covered in bruises at different healing stages, a painful map of her journey through hell. Sitting on her thin mattress, staring at her mother's torn photograph, she allowed a dark thought to take shape. Maybe the electric chair is a more merciful way out than continuing to live like this. Night fell in the prison like a heavy curtain of hopelessness. Elizabeth sat on the cold floor of her cell, back against the rough wall, staring at the small piece of blade she had managed to hide after the last manual labor workshop session. The metal glinted faintly in the dim light filtering through the barred window, as if whispering promises of eternal peace. Her hands trembled as she held the object, dark thoughts invading her mind. Maybe it's better this way, ending it all before they do it for me in the electric chair. Her mother's torn photograph lay beside her, the gentle smile split in half like her own life. The orange jumpsuit was still damp from the latest cafeteria attack, where several inmates had purposefully spilled their drinks on her. Their words still echoed in her ears. Maybe this way you'll feel a bit of the despair your victims felt, Granny Killer. Elizabeth touched the bruises on her face, remembering how no one had intervened, not even the guards. Her fingers caressed the sharp edge of the blade as she recalled the day's events. The humiliation in group therapy, where the psychologist simply watched as other inmates verbally attacked her. The prison doctor denying her painkillers for her bruised ribs, claiming killers don't deserve relief. The letter from her lawyer, informing her that her last appeal had been denied. Each memory was like a nail in her emotional coffin. The silence of the night was broken only by the sound of her own tears falling on the concrete floor. Elizabeth positioned the blade over her wrist, her hand shaking violently. Forgive me, Mom. I'm not as strong as you always said I was. I can't bear being treated like a monster for something I didn't do anymore. I can't stand seeing the reflection of a killer I'm not in everyone's eyes. It was then that she heard a low, painful moan coming from the next cell. Initially, she tried to ignore it, focused on her own despair. But the sound came again, this time accompanied by a feeble voice. Please, someone. I can't breathe. Elizabeth's professional instinct, dormant for months of trauma, began to slowly awaken. Approaching the wall separating the cells, Elizabeth was able to identify the source of the moans. It was Virginia Foster, a 70-year-old woman who had arrived the previous week, convicted of defending herself from a robbery that resulted in the aggressor's death. Through a small gap between the concrete blocks, Elizabeth could see the elderly woman sitting on her bed, clearly in distress. The cold metal in her hand now seemed to weigh a ton. Elizabeth looked at the blade, then at the gap in the wall, her mind in conflict. The elderly woman's moans were getting weaker, more desperate. Something inside her, something that months of abuse and humiliation had failed to completely kill, began to manifest itself. With a sudden movement, Elizabeth flushed the blade down the toilet, her heart accelerating with a new determination. She approached the wall again, now fully focused on her professional instinct. "Miss Virginia, it's Elizabeth from the next cell. I'm a nurse. I need you to tell me exactly what you're feeling. Are you having trouble breathing? Do you feel chest pain?" The answer came amid gasps. "Elizabeth, the nurse. I heard the others talking about you, but it doesn't matter now. I need help." Elizabeth began to guide the elderly woman through breathing techniques while frantically banging on the bars of her cell, trying to get the guards' attention. "Help! We have a medical emergency here. Miss Foster is having an attack." Amidst the ensuing chaos, with guards finally arriving and confusion setting in on the block, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a purpose. As she watched the medical team taking Ms. Virginia, who was still holding her hand through the bars, whispering thanks, a crystalline thought formed in her mind. "I can't give up. There are still people who need me. There is still good I can do, even in here. And most importantly, I need to be alive to prove my innocence and honor Mrs. Margarita's memory." The motel room on the outskirts of Savannah was not the most appropriate place to plan an infiltration into a maximum security prison, but it was the only safe place Jackson and Florence had found. The peeling walls were now covered with photos and diagrams of the prison, shift change schedules for the guards, and patrol routes. Jackson, still with visible bruises from the last interrogation, studied a floor plan of the complex while Florence typed furiously on her computer, "I've found something. Every Thursday between 10 and 11 in the morning, there's a routine inspection by the Department of Justice. It's our best chance to get in without raising suspicions." Scattered across the bed were various forged documents, badges, inspection orders, official authorizations. Florence had activated old contacts to get everything as discreetly as possible. Picking up one of the badges, she analyzed the meticulous work. "Jackson, now you're Inspector Antonio Flores from the General Comptroller's office. Have you memorized your backstory? We can't have any slip-ups." One mistake, and Elizabeth loses her last chance. The sound of sirens passing by on the avenue made the two instinctively duck down. Since they had escaped from Jackson's apartment, every noise was a potential threat. Regaining composure, he continued studying the documents on the prison guards. "There's something odd here, Florence. The morning shift has 5 guards who were transferred in the last 3 months. They all came from the same district that Judge Wallace controlled. It can't be a coincidence." Florence was working on her computer, trying to access the prison's security systems. Years of investigating cybercrime had given her skills that were now crucial. "Jackson, I got access to the internal cameras. Look at this. Every Thursday at exactly 10:15, the cameras in the South Corridor go into a repeating loop for 12 minutes. It's the exact time of the routine inspection. Someone is facilitating something. Or someone. The final preparations included every possible detail. Jackson rehearsed his posture, his gait, even the way he held the documents. Everything had to exude natural authority. Adjusting his tie in the motel's stained mirror, he mentally repeated, "I am Inspector Antonio Flores. I'm here for a routine inspection of security procedures with special focus on the execution sector." The plan was complex, but doable. Jackson would enter as an inspector, while Florence monitored everything from a van parked nearby, hacking into the security cameras. Communication would be maintained through a microscopic earpiece. Checking the equipment one last time, she warned, "Remember, you have exactly 12 minutes to find Elizabeth and get the information. 1 minute more and the cameras go back to normal." The hours leading up to the operation were devoted to memorizing every detail of the prison. Jackson obsessively studied the guards' faces, memorizing names, ranks, schedules. One photo in particular caught his attention. A recently transferred guard who appeared in previous records of suspicious cases. This one here, Santos? I've seen him before. He was present in at least 2 other cases where elderly people died under suspicious circumstances. The night wore on as they finalized the last details. Florence set up the communication equipment while Jackson reviewed his fake identity one more time. The weight of the mission was palpable in the air. It wasn't just about saving Elizabeth. It was about exposing a conspiracy that had destroyed countless lives. If we fail tomorrow, we won't get another chance. Elizabeth will be executed, and all the evidence connecting these deaths will die with her. The clock showed 3 in the morning when they finally finished the preparations. Jackson carefully stored his fake documents when Florence put a hand on his shoulder. Are you sure you want to do this? If they catch us, there's no going back. You know what they're capable of. Jackson merely nodded, his voice full of determination. That nurse is the only living person who can identify the killer. I won't let them kill her to silence her. Taking one last look at the documents scattered around the room, Jackson felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Tomorrow he would enter a fortress surrounded by people who would not hesitate to kill him if they discovered his true identity. Taking Elizabeth's photo, he murmured to himself, "Hold on. Tomorrow I'll get you out of that hell, even if it's the last thing I do." Morning came with a fine drizzle that made the prison even gloomier. Jackson, now fully characterized as Inspector Antonio Flores, crossed the main gates precisely at 10 o'clock. His well-cut suit and leather briefcase conveyed the necessary authority, but his heart pounded rapidly under the professional facade. Through the microscopic earpiece, Florence's voice was a constant whisper. 5 guards in the main courtyard. 3 of them are from Judge Wallace's team. Keep your distance, but don't show you recognize them. The entry process was tense. Each document checked. Each lingering look from a guard made his stomach churn. In the security cabin, a particularly attentive guard examined his credentials more carefully than normal. Jackson kept his expression neutral as he watched the man compare signatures. "Standard procedure, Mr. Inspector. We've had a few incidents recently. We need to be extra vigilant, especially with the execution approaching." The prison's main corridor was a maze of steel doors and security cameras. Jackson walked with measured steps, aware of the glances that followed him. Through the reflection in the reinforced windows, he noticed 2 guards whispering, their eyes fixed on his back. Florence's voice returned, now more urgent. "Jackson, the gate guard is making a call. Something about your credentials didn't convince him." A distant siren made all the guards move simultaneously, a pattern that seemed too rehearsed to be natural. Jackson realized he was being subtly surrounded, led down a specific corridor. For the first time, he noticed how the cameras moved in sync, creating small mobile blind spots. "Florence, they have a system. They're using the cameras to create safe routes. That's how they managed to kill all those elderly inmates without being detected." The administrative sector was buzzing with suspicious activity. Guards who should have been at their posts were circulating the corridors, exchanging meaningful glances. Jackson needed to reach the wing where Elizabeth was being held, but each step brought him closer to an obvious trap. Turning a corner, he nearly collided with guard Santos, who smiled in a predatory manner. "Mr. Inspector, what a coincidence. I was just reviewing some security procedures that might interest you." Time was running out. Through his earpiece, Jackson could hear Florence typing frantically. "The cameras will be back online in 7 minutes. Something's wrong. They're changing the security patterns. It's like they knew." She trailed off abruptly, and Jackson felt his blood run cold. Someone had discovered the camera system infiltration. The south corridor, his final destination, was now blocked by 3 guards feigning a casual conversation. Jackson recognized 2 of them from the files he had studied, both linked to previous suspicious deaths. He needed to think fast. Consulting his documents with feigned nonchalance, he announced loudly, "Gentlemen, I'll need to inspect the execution sector. Direct orders from the secretary's office." A palpable tension filled the air as one of the older guards approached, his hand casually resting on his holster. "Of course, Mr. Inspector. But before that, I'd like to verify a small discrepancy in your credentials." You know how it is, standard procedure. The man's smile didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. Jackson felt the noose tightening. Each guard in the corridor had assumed strategic positions, blocking escape routes. For the first time, he noticed small secondary cameras hidden in unlikely corners. A parallel surveillance system, invisible to those who didn't know where to look. Through his earpiece, Florence urgently whispered, "Jackson, get out of there now." They know. Somehow they know. The sound of boots in the corridor announced the arrival of more guards. Jackson kept his expression impassive as his mind worked frantically for an escape route. Meeting the gaze of the guard questioning his credentials, he allowed a slight smile to form on his lips. "Certainly, but first I need to make a call to my superior. I'm sure Judge Wallace will be interested in hearing about this." Excessive zeal. Guard Santos held Jackson's credential up to the light, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. The document, though perfectly forged, was being subjected to the most thorough examination it had ever faced. Sweat trickled down Jackson's back, but his expression remained impassive, the mask of authority perfectly maintained. For the first time, he noticed a small watermark on the guard's original badge, a detail his forgery lacked. Florence's voice sounded urgent in his ear. "Jackson, stay calm, stick to the plan, mention the judge if necessary." The corridor was tense, other guards watching the scene with veiled interest. Santos frowned, his fingers sliding over a cell phone. "You know, Mr. Inspector, something curious happened this morning. I received an alert about possible irregularities with credentials." Jackson adjusted his tie calmly, letting the silence stretch for a few seconds. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority that made Santos hesitate. "Irregularities? Interesting. Judge Wallace mentioned something similar when he personally assigned me to this inspection. He's particularly interested in certain activities here at the prison. The judge's name caused the expected effect." Santos paled slightly, his eyes quickly seeking those of the other guards. Jackson continued, his voice now lower, almost confidential. "In fact, the judge will be very interested in knowing why a simple inspection is meeting so much resistance, especially considering the recent events involving certain inmates." Santos's radio crackled with a coded message. He looked torn, glancing from the credentials to Jackson, clearly weighing his options. The mention of Judge Wallace had created visible doubt in his stance. Jackson seized the hesitation. "Should I call him now? I'm sure he'll appreciate knowing about this." Excess of zeal. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Inspector," Santos replied after a tense moment, returning the credentials. His voice still carried suspicion, but now mixed with a touch of concern. "Just following security protocols, especially with the execution approaching." He motioned for the other guards to stand down. Jackson calmly put away his documents, keeping his expression neutral as he felt the guards' eyes on his back. Florence's voice whispered in his ear. "They backed down but didn't let their guard down. Be quick." Adjusting his briefcase, Jackson addressed Santos. "I understand your dedication. I'm sure Judge Wallace will appreciate it too. Now I need to proceed with my inspection." Santos nodded stiffly, but his eyes remained alert. "Of course, Mr. Inspector. Should I accompany you?" Jackson waved a dismissive hand. "That won't be necessary. My orders are for an independent inspection. I'm sure you understand, higher orders." As he walked down the corridor toward the sector where Elizabeth was detained, Jackson could feel Santos's burning gaze on his back. He knew his ruse wouldn't last long. The guard would certainly make some calls as soon as he turned the corner. Florence's voice confirmed his thoughts. "You bought time, but not much. Be quick with Elizabeth." In the reflection of a bulletproof window, Jackson saw Santos whispering something into his radio. Time was running out, and he knew his cover would soon be blown. With steady steps, he turned the corner toward the maximum security wing. His thoughts focused on a single mission: find Elizabeth Walker before it was too late. Elizabeth Walker's cell was the last one in the maximum security corridor. Jackson strode through the sector with firm steps, his inspector ruse still intact, though he knew his time was precious. Through the earpiece, Florence kept watch. "Santos is still making calls. Be quick." Stopping in front of the cell, Jackson observed the woman sitting on the edge of the thin mattress, her eyes once vibrant in the case photos, now dull, marked by deep shadows. "Ms. Walker, I'm Inspector Antonio Flores. I need to ask some questions about security procedures. The look Elizabeth cast Jackson was a mixture of mistrust and resignation. Months in prison had taught her that each new authority meant another form of torment. Rising slowly, she adjusted her faded orange uniform and approached the bars. More questions? I thought everything was already decided for my execution. Her voice was but a whisper, laced with bitterness and hopelessness. Jackson quickly checked the corridor before moving closer to the bars. Lowering his voice, he revealed, "Elizabeth, listen carefully. I'm not an inspector. My name is Jackson Wallace. I'm an investigator. I'm here because I believe in your innocence." Her eyes widened slightly, a spark of hope appearing for the first time in months. An investigator? But why? Everyone has already condemned me. Aware of the limited time, Jackson got straight to the point. I found connections between Mrs. Margarita's death and other similar cases. Rich elderly people dying under suspicious circumstances, tampered wills, innocent people being framed. But I need you to tell me exactly what happened that night. Every detail can be crucial. Elizabeth visibly trembled, the memories of that night still fresh in her mind, like an open wound. With a choked voice, Elizabeth began her account. Everything was normal until that night. Mrs. Margarita was sleeping. I was making my usual rounds. That's when I heard voices in the hallway, Vivian talking to a man. I couldn't see his face, it was too dark, but his voice. She paused, closing her eyes as if trying to relive the moment. His voice was deep, authoritative. They were talking about the will, about how everything needed to be done that specific night. Jackson frantically scribbled every word in his small notebook as Florence warned in his ear, 10 minutes, Jackson. Santos is moving in your direction." Pressing for more details, he asked, "And then? What happened with the medications?" Elizabeth gripped the bars tightly, her fingers turning white. "Someone swapped them while I was in the garden. When I came back, I smelled a masculine scent in the air, the same one I'd sensed in the hallway. I tried to alert them about the swap, but Vivian, she had already planned everything." The distant sound of boots in the corridor made Jackson speed up the interrogation. "Elizabeth, I need you to focus. That voice, do you think you could recognize it if you heard it again?" Their eyes met through the bars, a mutual understanding passing between them. "Yes," she replied firmly. "I'll never forget that voice. It haunts my nightmares every night." The urgency in Florence's voice increased. "Jackson, Santos called for a surprise inspection in the sector. You have 5 minutes tops." He moved even closer to the bars, his voice barely a whisper. "Elizabeth, we're investigating a bigger conspiracy. It's not just about Mrs. Margarita. There are other cases, other deaths. We need something concrete, anything that could help us identify this man." Silent tears began to stream down Elizabeth's face as she shared her last piece of information. "The only thing I have is that voice. Deep, authoritative, with a slight northern accent and a phrase. He said something about standard procedure when he was in the hallway, as if he had done it before. The time was running out. Footsteps were approaching, now more distinct. Jackson quickly put away his notebook while whispering his last instructions. "Elizabeth, I promise I'll get you out of here, but I need you to hold on a little longer. And if you hear that voice again anywhere, you need to let us know. It could be our only chance." The sound of approaching boots echoed through the prison corridors like an omen of a storm. Jackson quickly resumed his inspector's posture, stepping back a few steps from the bars, while pretending to make notes on his clipboard. Florence's urgent voice sounded in his ear. "Santos is leading a search team, 5 armed guards. They already know something is wrong, Jackson. You need to get out of there now." Elizabeth noticed the change in the atmosphere. Years in prison had sharpened her senses to imminent danger. She sat down on her bed, trying to seem casual as she watched Jackson through the bars. The metallic sound of doors being opened and closed approached, accompanied by guards' shouts ordering the prisoners to step away from the bars. A deep, familiar voice cut through the air. "Surprise inspection, all inmates against the wall. Inspector Flores, what a surprise to find you right in this sector." Santos emerged in the corridor like a looming shadow, followed by his team of guards. His eyes alternated between Jackson and Elizabeth like a predator assessing his prey. Jackson kept his composure, slowly turning to face him. Just doing my duty, Officer Santos. This wing requires special attention, considering recent events. The guard approached, a cold smile playing on his lips. Certainly, especially with certain unexpected visitors showing up. Chaos ensued in the block as the guards began the search. Cells were invaded, belongings tossed around, inmates pushed against walls. Jackson remained still, his heart pounding furiously as he watched Santos coordinate the operation with military precision. Through the earpiece, Florence whispered frantically, "They're blocking the exits one by one. Jackson, you need to find a way out in the next 3 minutes." A piercing scream cut through the air as the guards reached the cell next to Elizabeth's. Santos seemed to be purposefully prolonging the process, slowly approaching his real target. Jackson seized the moment to check his watch, a calculated gesture. "Officer Santos, I appreciate your dedication, but I have a meeting with Judge Wallace in 40 minutes. He's particularly interested in my report on this inspection." The judge's name caused a momentary hesitation in Santos, but his eyes remained suspicious. He approached Jackson, lowering his voice. "Curious. I just spoke with the judge's office. They seem surprised by your visit." Jackson felt his blood run cold, but kept his expression neutral. "Really? I suggest you speak directly with the judge then. I'm sure he'll appreciate knowing that his subordinates are questioning his direct orders." The tension in the corridor was palpable. The other guards had stopped their search, attentive to the silent confrontation unfolding. Elizabeth watched it all from her cell, her heart racing, aware that one wrong move could shatter her last hope. Santos took another step forward, his hand resting casually on his holster. "You know, Inspector, something tells me Judge Wallace is going to want to have a very interesting conversation with you." It was then that the fire alarm went off, filling the prison with its deafening wail. Florence's voice sounded triumphant in Jackson's earpiece. "Now, emergency protocol, they have to release the exits." Santos hesitated for a crucial moment, torn between maintaining his suspicion about Jackson and following security protocol. It was all Jackson needed. "Officer, I suggest you follow the emergency procedures. Unless you want to explain to the judge why you ignored a security protocol." The ensuing chaos was his salvation. Guards running, inmates being relocated, orders being shouted. In the midst of the confusion, Jackson began to move towards the exit. Before turning the corner, he cast one last look at Elizabeth. In her eyes, a silent promise. He would come back. Santos was shouting orders, but his voice was drowned out by the deafening alarm. "Keep all inmates in their cells and don't let the inspector." The alarm finally fell silent, leaving only the echo of chaos in its wake. Jackson had managed to get out of the sector, but he needed one last conversation with Elizabeth. Taking advantage of the ongoing confusion of the search, he discreetly returned to her cell. She was already waiting near the bars, her face marked by urgency. The voice in, "It's our only concrete proof, but how are we going to find him? How do you identify someone by just their voice in an entire city?" The frustration was evident on Jackson's face as he processed the information. All his investigative work, all the connections he had uncovered, and it all boiled down to a faceless voice. Quickly consulting his watch, he whispered, "Are you sure there's nothing else? Any detail about his appearance, something you saw even for a second?" Elizabeth closed her eyes, trying to relive that fateful night. It was too dark. I only heard his voice in the hallway, deep and authoritative. And then, that perfume when the medication was switched. The sound of approaching boots again made Jackson step away from the bars. Florence's voice sounded urgent in his ear. "Jackson, Santos is coming back. He made a call. I think they finally confirmed you're not an inspector." But Jackson needed more information. "Elizabeth, think carefully." That voice. You said it had a northern accent. Any other distinctive features? Tears of frustration glistened in Elizabeth's eyes as she replied, "I can't explain it. It's more the way he spoke. Like someone used to giving orders, to being obeyed, but without that voice, Gurn, without being able to identify him. Who's going to believe me?" Her voice trembled as she continued, "I'm just a convicted nurse. My word is worthless against them." Jackson could hear the movement of the guards intensifying in the adjacent corridors. Time was running out. He approached the bars one last time. "Elizabeth, I need you to trust me. I'll find this man, but you need to stay alert. If you hear that voice again anywhere, it's our only chance." She nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "How will I warn you? I'm isolated here, without contact with the outside world." Santos's voice echoed down the hallway, now without any pretense of cordiality. "Find the imposter, he's still in the building." Jackson knew he needed to leave immediately, but he still had one last instruction. "The prison nurse Virginia, she'll be our contact. If you hear the voice, find a way to warn her." Before leaving, Elizabeth made one last revelation that chilled Jackson's blood. "There's one more thing. Something the man said that night. He said he had done this before, and that he knew exactly how the police would investigate." The implications were clear. The killer wasn't just experienced, he knew police procedures from the inside. The guard's footsteps were dangerously close now. Jackson began to move away, but Elizabeth called him one last time, her voice almost a whisper. "Jackson, my execution has been moved up. I have only 1 week left. If we don't find this man by then..." She didn't need to complete the sentence. The ensuing silence carried the weight of a death sentence. The crackling of radios announced the approach of the search team. Jackson cast one last look at Elizabeth before disappearing down the corridor. His final sight was of her face through the bars, a mixture of hope and despair. In his ear, Florence warned, "Jackson, Santos is blocking all the exits. If we don't get out now..." In her cell, Elizabeth stared into the void, her last words echoing in the silence. "A voice. Our only proof is a voice. How do we prove it's him? How do we make someone believe before it's too late?" The sun had barely risen when Jackson passed through the gates of the Foster mansion, dressed in a ragged overalls and carrying gardening tools. His face, now covered by a scruffy beard of several days, was unrecognizable compared to the policeman he used to be. Florence monitored everything from a van parked 2 blocks away. "The security guards changed shifts 10 minutes ago. You have a 2-hour window before Vivian wakes up. The entire camera system is on a loop." The mansion seemed even larger and more imposing than in the photos he had studied. Jackson began working in the flower beds near the main windows, his calloused hands moving with the experience of someone who truly knew the trade, the result of 3 intensive days of training with a retired gardener. As he pruned the bushes, his eyes mapped every entrance, every window, every blind spot. "Her office is on the 2nd floor, right window. I saw movement in the kitchen, probably the maid preparing breakfast." A security guard walked past him, barely giving him a glance. Jackson continued his work, keeping his head down while whistling a random tune. His gardening tools concealed more sophisticated equipment, tiny cameras, listening devices, lock-picking tools. Florence's voice sounded in his ear. "The maid is going upstairs to wake Vivian. That's your chance to check the 1st floor." Moving naturally through the garden, Jackson approached the back entrance. The key he had obtained from the former gardener, for a considerable sum, fit the lock perfectly. The interior of the mansion was a monument to opulence, every object screaming the Fosters' power and wealth. With silent steps, he made his way to Vivian's private office on the 1st floor. "I'm inside, this place. It's like she wants to rub everyone's face in the money she stole from her mother." The first drawer he opened revealed various bank documents. Nothing incriminating at first glance, but Jackson photographed everything anyway. The second drawer contained something more interesting: records of bank transfers to overseas accounts. Florence digitized each image in real time. These transfers started exactly 1 week before Donna Margarita's death. It's not enough proof, but it's a pattern. The sound of footsteps upstairs made Jackson freeze. Vivian had woken up earlier than expected. With precise movements, he began to put the documents back in their places. But something caught his attention: a folder marked "Special Procedures." Inside, he found records of payments to various prison employees, including some guards. Florence, she has people bought everywhere, but it's still not enough to prove she ordered the murder. A particularly interesting file contained reports on other wealthy elderly people in the region. Jackson felt his stomach churn as he realized they were potential future targets. He quickly photographed the pages while whispering, "They don't plan to stop. Donna Margarita was just one in a series of planned murders." Florence's voice cut through his thoughts. "Jackson, movement on the stairs. Vivian is coming down." With the agility acquired in years of covert operations, Jackson put all the documents back in their exact places and left the office. Seconds later, he was back in the garden, pruning bushes as if he had never left. Vivian passed by the window, her face a mask of arrogance as she spoke on the phone. Yes, everything is going according to plan. The execution has been moved up. We won't have any more trouble with that meddling nurse. A movement at the gate caught Jackson's attention. A familiar car was entering the property. His heart nearly stopped when he recognized the driver. It was Santos, the prison guard. Florence noticed his tension. "Jackson, get out of there now. If he recognizes you." But Jackson couldn't move. Any sudden movement would draw attention. He continued working, his face partially hidden by the cap as he watched Santos enter the mansion. "He's here to discuss the execution. They're tying up all the loose ends." The sun now punished the garden while Jackson maintained his charade, each minute an eternity. Through the windows, he could see shadows moving in the office. Vivian and Santos in a meeting he'd give anything to listen to. His only solace was the documents he had photographed, even if they weren't definitive proof. "We're getting close, Florence, but time is running out." The midday heat scorched the garden when Jackson noticed an opportunity. Vivian and Santos had left the office for lunch on the terrace, leaving their folders on the table. Seizing the moment, he moved discreetly to a flower bed near the office window. Florence's voice sounded tense in his ear. "Jackson, it's too risky. The guards are patrolling every 15 minutes. Under the pretext of pruning the taller bushes, Jackson gained a clear view of the office interior. One of the folders was partially open, revealing what appeared to be a list of names. Using a small camera disguised as part of his tools, he began photographing what he could see through the window. That's when he noticed something disturbing, an official police department document with the header of the Special Investigations Division. A guard began approaching, making his usual rounds. Jackson kept his movement steady, pruning the bushes as if that were his only interest in the world. The man stopped a few meters away, lighting a cigarette. "Hey, you're new here, aren't you? Never seen you before." Jackson continued his work, answering without raising his face. "First day, Mr. Foster recommended me to replace him while he recovers from surgery." The sound of a door closing upstairs made everyone look up. Santos was exiting hastily, carrying a different folder than the one he'd brought. Something about his demeanor caught Jackson's attention. He seemed tense, worried. Through the earpiece, Florence commented, "I just intercepted a call. He's heading straight to the prison. Something about final preparations." The guard kept watching Jackson with growing interest. "Funny, I talked to Foster yesterday, and he didn't mention anything about a replacement." Sweat trickled down Jackson's back, but his movements remained calm and precise. He must have forgotten. You know how confused he's been since the accident. His eyes, however, never left the folder Santos had left on the office table. Taking advantage of a momentary distraction as the guard answered his radio, Jackson managed to photograph a few more pages through the window. One name caught his attention. It was the record of a police officer recently transferred to the prison's execution division. Next to it, a handwritten note, "Reliable, standard procedure." The same words Elizabeth had mentioned overhearing that night. The guard hung up his radio and turned his full attention back to Jackson. "You know what? I'm going to call Foster right now, just to confirm your story." Jackson felt his heart race but remained calm. "Sure, no problem. You just might not be able to reach him right now. Last time I saw him, he was sedated from the surgery." Vivian appeared on the balcony, her voice cutting through the air like a razor. "Is there a problem here?" The guard straightened up. "Mrs. Foster, I was just verifying the new gardener's credentials." She observed Jackson for a moment, her cold eyes calculating. "Let him work. We have more important matters to resolve." A movement on the street caught Jackson's eye. Another familiar car was approaching the mansion. Florence urgently whispered, "Jackson, it's Judge Wallace. He can't see you." Panic started to set in as Jackson realized he was trapped in the garden, with the guard still watching him and the judge about to arrive. Judge Wallace's car passed through the mansion's gates, exactly as Jackson managed to hide behind a large hibiscus bush. Through the leaves, he observed the unfolding scene. Wallace, Vivian, and Santos, the three main conspirators, gathered in one place. Florence's voice sounded urgent in his ear. "You need to get out of there now. If any of them recognize you." The sentence hung in the air, laden with dark possibilities. The guard who had questioned him remained nearby, now more alert after the judge's arrival. Jackson kept himself busy, his hands working mechanically, while his mind processed the information he'd uncovered. The photographed documents, though not definitive proof, showed a clear pattern. Suspicious bank transfers, records of reliable police officers, the phrase "standard procedure" appearing repeatedly. A heated conversation started on the balcony, voices kept low but tense. Jackson couldn't make out the exact words, but their body language said it all. Something had gone wrong with their plans. Wallace gestured nervously. Vivian maintained her arrogant posture, and Santos seemed especially disturbed. Florence, something happened. They're worried about something. That's when a crucial detail caught his attention. In his hurry to leave earlier, Santos had left his folder partially open on a table on the terrace. From his hiding spot, Jackson could partially see a document, a prison service schedule. His heart raced when he noticed the date. It was the scheduled day for Elizabeth's execution. Florence's voice cut through his thoughts. "Jackson, I intercepted a communication from the prison. They've moved up the execution to the day after tomorrow. We're out of time." Panic began to set in as he watched the three conspirators arguing, now more agitated. The final piece of the puzzle was right there in front of him, but still out of reach. Santos began descending the stairs toward the garden, his face a mask of concern. He passed so close to Jackson that he could smell his cologne, a familiar scent that triggered something in his memory. A connection began forming in his mind, but before he could process it fully, the guard was back. "Hey, Gardner! Your shift is over for today. Mrs. Foster wants all staff off the property immediately." Gathering his tools with a calmness he didn't feel, Jackson cast one last glance at the terrace. Judge Wallace had disappeared inside the house, but Vivian remained, a satisfied smile on her face as she spoke on the phone. The words he caught made his blood run cold. Yes, all set for the day after tomorrow. Our friend on the execution detail is ready. As he walked towards the exit, each step carefully measured not to arouse suspicion, Jackson felt the weight of the discoveries. They were close, so close to uncovering the truth, but time was running out rapidly. Elizabeth's voice echoed in his mind. The only concrete proof they had was a voice she had sworn to recognize. At the gate, Jackson stopped for a moment, adjusting his tools. Behind him, he could hear Santos talking on the phone, his deep, authoritative voice cutting through the afternoon air. "Yes, everything will be done according to standard procedure." Those words, that voice. For a moment, something seemed to click in his mind, but the guard pushed him out. "Let's go, circulate, and don't come back without express permission." In the van, Florence was waiting for him with a tense expression. "Jackson, did you find anything useful?" He looked one last time at the mansion, his mind racing. "Maybe, but we need to hurry. We have less than 48 hours before the execution, and our only proof remains a voice that Elizabeth swears to recognize." What he didn't say, what he barely dared admit to himself, was that a terrible suspicion was beginning to form in his mind about who the owner of that voice would be. The death row had never seemed so long for Elizabeth Walker. Her steps echoed heavily as she was escorted by two guards towards the execution chamber. Her orange uniform, now replaced by a simple white garment, seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. Outside the prison, Jackson and Florence watched the activity through the monitors installed in their surveillance van. Jackson's face was tense, marked by sleepless nights. There has to be a way. We can't let them finish like this. In the execution chamber, the electric chair dominated the environment like a sinister presence. Elizabeth watched the apparatus with a mixture of terror and resignation. Through the glass separating the room from the observers, she could see familiar faces gathering. Reporters, prison authorities, and Vivian Foster, who kept a discreet smile on her lips. The minutes dragged on as the final procedures were carried out. Each check, each protocol followed was like a stab in Elizabeth's heart. The prison chaplain approached, offering his last words of comfort. "May God have mercy on your soul, my child." She just nodded, her silent tears falling on the white dress. Jackson and Florence watched helplessly as the preparations continued. Through the security cameras they had managed to access, they followed every movement inside the execution chamber. Florence typed frantically on her computer, searching for any flaw in the system she could use. "We can't invade the building. There are armed guards at every entrance. We need something more, some concrete proof." The tension in the execution chamber increased with every second. The technicians made the final adjustments to the electric chair, checking connections and voltages. Elizabeth was led to the metal seat, her wrists and ankles secured with leather straps. Her heart was beating so hard it seemed to want to escape her chest. Outside, Jackson felt torn between despair and rage. All the evidence they had collected, all the documents photographed at the mansion, nothing was concrete enough to stop that execution. His mind worked frantically, searching for any alternative. There has to be something we're missing, some connection we missed. The prison warden entered the room, carrying the official documents for the execution. His voice sounded monotonous as he read the charges and the sentence. Elizabeth kept her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her tears now dry. In her mind, she repeated like a mantra, "Mrs. Margarita, forgive me for not being able to prove the truth." The observers began to settle behind the bulletproof glass. Vivian Foster took a place in the front row, her face a mask of false solemnity. Next to her, Judge Wallace kept a grave expression, while Santos watched everything from a more secluded corner. The atmosphere was charged with palpable tension. The designated executor entered the room, his face partially covered by a black hood. His movements were precise, mechanical, as if he had done this countless times. He approached the control panel, his gloved hands resting on the lever that would activate the electric current. Jackson and Florence watched every move through the monitors, feeling the helplessness grow. Time was running out, and they still hadn't found a way to prevent this injustice. Florence's voice trembled as she whispered, "Jackson, we can't let this happen." The silence was deafening. They adjusted the final controls on the panel, his hooded figure moving with a disturbing familiarity around the electric chair. Elizabeth closed her eyes, feeling the cold metal against her back. The prison warden made a gesture, indicating that it was time to proceed with the execution. Jackson and Florence watched the scene through the monitors, their hearts pounding. Something in the executor's movement caught Jackson's attention. There was a confidence in his gestures, an authority that seemed familiar. For the first time, he noticed how he checked every detail of the procedure, like someone who was intimately acquainted not only with the execution, but the entire death process. The executor approached the control panel, his hands resting on the fatal lever. His voice sounded deep and authoritative through the black hood. "May God forgive us." The words had barely left his lips when Elizabeth opened her eyes abruptly, her whole body tense against the straps. That voice, the same voice that had haunted her nightmares for months. "Stop! Don't turn on the chair. I have something to say before my execution." Elizabeth's scream cut through the air like a blade. "It was you. I recognize your voice. You were there that night. You killed Mrs. Margarita." Chaos ensued instantly in the room. The observers rose from their chairs, exalted voices mingling in confusion. Through the glass, Jackson saw Vivian Foster's face lose all color. The executioner took a step back, his posture visibly changing. For a moment it seemed he would pull the lever anyway, but the prison warden had already approached, demanding that everyone remain calm. Santos, observing from the spectator area, instinctively brought his hand to his weapon. "That voice," Elizabeth continued, her words heavy with absolute certainty. "You said the same words that night, 'May God forgive us,' before switching the medications. You're the killer." The executioner remained motionless, his hand still on the lever, while the guards present looked at each other, uncertain of how to proceed. Jackson and Florence watched the scene unfold through the monitors, their bodies tense and ready for action. "This is it, Florence," Jackson shouted, already running toward the prison entrance. "She recognized the voice. We finally have our proof." Over the radio they could hear the confusion spreading throughout the prison, contradictory orders being shouted. In the execution chamber, the warden tried to maintain control of the situation, ordering everyone to keep their places. But Elizabeth wouldn't stop. "Take off his hood. Let everyone see the true killer's face. He killed Mrs. Margarita on orders from her own daughter." Her eyes found Vivian's through the glass, seeing the panic grow on the face of the woman who had orchestrated her downfall. The executioner suddenly moved toward the lever, his intention clear: to silence Elizabeth before more truths were revealed. Time seemed to slow as his gloved hand reached for the control that would send thousands of volts through the innocent nurse's body. At that precise moment, Jackson and Florence burst through the execution chamber door. Chaos erupted in the execution chamber as Jackson and Florence invaded. In a matter of seconds, Jackson lunged at the executioner, tackling him before he could pull the lever. Florence ran to Elizabeth, her nimble hands working to undo the straps of the electric chair. The guards, caught off guard by the sudden invasion, hesitated long enough for events to become irreversible. "Get her out of here," Jackson shouted as he wrestled with the executioner on the floor. The black hood had come loose during the struggle, revealing a face every police officer present knew well. Officer Castro, responsible for executions at the prison for over a decade. Florence managed to free Elizabeth and pulled her away from the chair while the spectators watched in horror through the bulletproof glass. Amidst the ensuing chaos, Jackson managed to subdue Castro, using his former police skills to immobilize him. With a precise strike, he landed a blow to render him unconscious. Florence, displaying surprising strength, dragged Elizabeth out of the chamber, locking the door from the outside, isolating everyone else inside, including Vivian and Judge Wallace. "Quick!" Jackson yelled to Florence. "Strap him into the chair!" With agile movements, they hoisted Castro's unconscious body and strapped him into the very spot Elizabeth had occupied moments before. The restraints were tightened as sounds of panic came from the other side of the glass. Vivian shouting orders, guards trying to break down the door, but the execution chamber's security system had been designed to be impenetrable. Castro began to regain consciousness, his eyes opening to find a reversed reality. Now he was the one strapped into the electric chair. Jackson positioned himself by the control panel, his face a mask of determination. "Time for the truth, Castro. We know it was you that night. Elizabeth recognized your voice. Now you're going to tell us everything, or we'll find out if this chair still works." "You wouldn't dare," Castro growled, but the fear in his eyes betrayed his false confidence. Jackson placed his hand on the lever. "I have nothing left to lose. My career ended the moment I stormed this place, but you have a lot to lose." Sweat beaded on Castro's face as he watched Jackson's hand caress the chair's control. "They'll break through that door any minute," Florence warned, keeping Elizabeth shielded behind her. Jackson nodded. "Then you better start talking fast, Castro. How did the scheme work? Who else is involved?" Jackson's hand moved the lever a few millimeters, causing the chamber's lights to flicker ominously. It was then that Castro broke. All right. It was Vivian who planned it all. She approached me months ago, knew about my job at the prison. The plan was simple. I'd switch the medications, make it look like the nurse was guilty. It wasn't the first time. We did the same with other rich elderly. The words poured out now, like a dam finally breached. "Go on," Jackson ordered, his voice cutting. Castro swallowed hard. Judge Wallace was in on it from the start. He made sure the cases were tried the right way. Santos handled the prison side, made sure evidence disappeared. It was the perfect scheme, until this nurse recognized my voice. On the other side of the glass, Vivian Foster had lost all composure, shouting orders no one obeyed anymore. Judge Wallace tried to maintain dignity, but his face was paper white. Santos had vanished, probably trying to flee while he still could. "Got it all recorded?" Jackson asked Florence, who nodded, showing her phone still capturing audio. Castro continued his confession, revealing names, dates, details of other murders. Every word dug the conspirators' graves deeper. Elizabeth watched it all with tears in her eyes, tears no longer of despair, but of relief and justice. The sound of sirens began to fill the air. Reinforcements were arriving. Jackson looked at Castro, still strapped to the chair. "I hope you've made peace with God, because you're going to need him where you're headed." The execution chamber doors finally opened, but it wasn't the corrupt guards entering. It was the federal police, summoned by Florence minutes earlier. The last thing Vivian Foster saw before being handcuffed was Elizabeth Walker's victorious smile. The innocent nurse whose greed had almost killed her, but who would now be the instrument of her ruin. The morning sun illuminated the courtroom as the presiding judge of the Superior Court struck his gavel one last time in the Walker case. 6 months had passed since the dramatic scene in the execution chamber, and now justice finally completed its cycle. Elizabeth, wearing an elegant business suit that replaced her prison uniform, listened with tears in her eyes to the final decision. Her innocence officially recognized, $1 million compensation for the damages suffered, and the promise that her accusers would face the full weight of the law. In the front row of the audience, Jackson and Florence watched with satisfaction as Vivian Foster and her accomplices were condemned. Donna Margarita's daughter, who had struggled so hard to maintain her appearance of sophistication, now wore the orange prison uniform. Judge Wallace, Castro, and several others involved in the criminal scheme had made deals with the prosecution, revealing a corruption network that extended for years. Vivian Foster was the only one who refused to cooperate, maintaining her arrogance until the end. Her sentence was the harshest: death by electric chair, an irony that did not go unnoticed. The same death she had planned for an innocent would now be her own fate. Upon hearing her sentence for the first time, her aristocratic face showed fear. Weeks later, Elizabeth stood in front of a renovated building downtown. The golden plaque at the entrance announced, "Guardian Angels Specialized Elder Care Services." With the compensation received, she had turned her painful experience into something positive. A company dedicated to protecting and caring for vulnerable elderly, employing rigorously selected and trained nurses. Donna Margarita would be proud, she whispered to herself, touching the necklace that had belonged to her former patient, a posthumous gift that the family had found along with a letter addressed to her. In the document, the elderly woman expressed her complete trust in Elizabeth and her concern about her daughter's intentions. The letter had been further proof of the conspiracy, although it had not been needed after Castro's confession. In his police office, Jackson received his medal for bravery and exceptional service. His reintegration into the force had been immediate after the case was resolved. The department, eager to clean up its image after the scandal, had not only reinstated him but promoted him to chief of the new division of crimes against the elderly and vulnerable. His walls, once covered with unsolved cases, now displayed reports on the success of the Walker case and the reforms it had inspired in the judicial system. Florence knocked on his door at the end of that afternoon, carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of wine. Her smile was radiant as she poured the drink. "To celebrate your promotion, Chief." Jackson smiled, noticing how the evening light enhanced his partner's beauty. For a moment, something passed between them, an electric tension, an unexplored possibility. Their eyes met over the wine glasses, and for an instant, Jackson considered taking a step beyond the friendship that had united them throughout that journey. But the moment passed. They both knew their lives had taken different directions. Florence had accepted a promotion in another city, leading her own special investigations unit. Jackson, on the other hand, had found his true purpose: to use his experience to protect those who could not defend themselves alone. "To justice," he toasted, his smile bittersweet. Florence nodded, understanding what did not need to be said. "To justice." They drank in silence, knowing that their paths, though parallel, would follow separately. The next morning, Jackson was in his office, studying a new case. Another elderly person dead under suspicious circumstances, another potential predator to be hunted down. On his desk, Donna Margarita's photo smiled alongside the headline announcing her daughter's conviction. He gently touched the clipping, a silent promise on his lips. "As long as I live, no innocent will be condemned on my watch." At her clinic, Elizabeth prepared for another day of work, her trauma transformed into purpose. The nurses arrived one by one, all with different stories, but united by the same mission: to protect and care. On the wall of her office, a framed phrase summed up her new life philosophy: "The truth always finds its way." The city continued its rhythm, its streets guarding the secrets of so many untold stories. But now there was hope. A determined cop, a resilient businesswoman, and a safety net for those most in need. Justice, although sometimes slow, had prevailed. And for Jackson, alone in his office but at peace with his choices, the fight continued, one battle at a time, one life at a time, until all the innocents could sleep safely. If Jackson and Elizabeth's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and check out the story now.